Consider that, with the majority of them, the very fact of their being sailors argues a certain recklessness and sensualism of character, ignorance and depravity. Consider that they are generally friendless and alone in the world. There are classes of men in the world who bear the same relations to society at large that the wheels do to a coach, and are just as indispensable. But however easy and delectable the springs upon which the insiders pleasantly vibrate, however sumptuous the hammercloth and glossy the door panels, yet for all this the wheels must still revolve in dusty or muddy revolutions. No contrivance, no sagacity can lift them out of the mire. For upon something the coach must be bottomed, on something the insiders must roll. Now sailors form one of these wheels. They go and come round the globe. They are the true importers and exporters of spices and silks, of fruits and vines and marbles. They carry missionaries, ambassadors, opera singers, armies, merchants, tourists, scholars to their destination. They are the bridge of boats across the Atlantic. They are the primum mobile of all commerce. And in short, were they to immigrate in a body to man the navies of the moon, almost everything would stop here on Earth, except its revolution on its axis and the orators in the American Congress. And yet, what are sailors? What in your heart do you think of that fellow staggering along the dock? Do you not give him a wide berth, shun him, and account him but little above the brutes that perish? Herman Melville, 1850. What Herman Melville is telling us is that, at its very heart, all maritime history is an expression of economic and labor history. And, as the Bank of Manhattan put it, glancing backwards from 1915, quote, "Prior to 1860, all the great fortunes of the country had come from the sea, and ships and shipping were the most conspicuous feature of New York business life." End quote. Melville's novels, more than any other, illuminate the dependence of the antebellum economy upon what is now being named maritime toxic masculinity. As a Whitman scholar, my central motivations are to understand Walt Whitman's place in the meteoric rise of the Port of New York, and his claim that a new doctrine of adhesiveness or manly love could bind the nation as tightly as the iron bands which bound a ship's barrels. While I am far more interested in love between men than sex between men, the frontier for scholarship today lies in the hypersexuality exhibited by Whitman's and Melville's beloved sailors. Indeed, historians of the Age of Sail appreciate that any favorable literary reference to sailors made the self-appointed guardians of Victorian morality very, very uneasy. Father Edward Thompson Taylor once snarled at his Methodist handlers, "I remember when you kept a man at the door of your churches to shut out those who wore a tarpaulin hat and a blue jacket." The respectable position was that sailors chose to become pariahs by indulging their own self-destructive propensities, boozing, gambling, brawling, dancing, overspending, and whoring, contributing, if nothing else, to Sailor Town's epidemic of venereal disease. Even the outrageous privations, harsh discipline, grueling labor, and high danger necessarily associated with the occupation were all understood to be self-destructive. In Redburn, Herman Melville astutely identified the problem as a sailor's intrinsically reckless, restless, thrill-seeking personality. Melville intuitively understood that what modern psychologists call sensation-seeking behavior resulted in a distinct class of men. They create significant public health problems for themselves as well as others, explains psychologist Marvin Zuckerman. Today's brief sensation-seeking scale contains items such as, I get restless when I spend too much time at home. I prefer friends who are excitingly unpredictable. I like to do frightening things. And I like wild parties. Zuckerman discovered that risk-taking per se is not the point of sensation-seeking behavior, but rather the price to pay for novelty, change, and excitement. This includes activities that are not intrinsically dangerous, such as travel to exotic places. But clearly, it extends to thrill-seeking activities such as rock climbing or, in the obvious case of the sailor, mast climbing. The greatest risk-takers are young males. The military has always preferred younger men for soldiers, writes Zuckerman, not only because of their physical strength, but for their willingness to risk their lives in combat. Their high testosterone fuels disinhibition, aggression, and antisocial behaviors. After the age of 50, men's scores for sensation-seeking tend to drop by at least 50%. Today, there is reason to think that such a class of men are much more than mere accidents of fate or social constructs. 60% of the tendency to possess these traits can be explained by genetics, and there is growing evidence that the thrill-seeking brain is anatomically distinct, as suggested by the studies of Avram Holmes and colleagues. Zuckerman concludes, although risk-taking can prove fatal, it is a positive force as well. Without risky experiences, humanity would stagnate. There would be little impetus for discovery. My work has shown that people have basic need for excitement, and one way or another, they will fulfill it. What is particularly interesting to historians of sexuality is the disinhibition of taboos, as Zuckerman put it, through deviant lifestyles and boredom susceptibility. In Seeing the World, Charles Nordhoff observed that a sailor feels contented nowhere. When on shore, he sighs for the ocean. No sooner is he there than he ardently wishes himself back to port. Melville's white jacket exposed a poorly kept secret about these pariahs. The sins for which the cities of the plain were overthrown still linger in some of these wooden-walled Gomorrahs of the deep. A few years later, the Navy published official confirmation. One ship's doctor, writing anonymously, affirmed the sheer prevalence of sexual contact and the refusal of officers to address it. He claimed to have never been on a ship in which same-sex acts failed to be practiced. Was forbidden same-sex behavior afloat and forbidden prostitution ashore two sides of the same coin? Were they both lures to ensnare a captive labor force?
will you touch? Huh?
Well, that is not the kind of question the Victorians were likely to address head on. But Melville had quite a gift for camouflaging very profound insights with coy sarcasm, especially when he realized that no other author would ever dare. Society erected a firewall between portraying passionate love between men and portraying passionate sex between men. The unwritten rule was, writers were allowed to discuss one or the other, but never both simultaneously. We have already heard Melville and White Jacket address the realities of same-sex acts among sailors, to a degree of frankness which no other novelist dared. But the kind of censorship just described by the U.S. Navy remained in effect when he composed Moby Dick. And this novel portrays real love between men, namely in the famous honeymoon scene between Ishmael and Queequeg. Moby Dick furnishes an intersection between Melville and Whitman. Like Leaves of Grass, it contains oblique references to Quakers and Quakerism. For Whitman, brotherly love could have a distinctly erotic edge, illustrated here by the gender-bending David and Jonathan painted by the Quaker minister Edward Hicks. Following the schismatic theologian Elias Hicks, Whitman believed that the inner light manifested as a still small voice. It could authorize conscience to violate the shall nots of the Christian tradition. There is no evidence to suggest that this theology appealed to Melville, but in his chapter about Nantucket's whalers, he simply could not refrain from satirizing the paradox of strict Christians profiting from such a profoundly sexualized workplace. In order to skirt censorship, he seems at first to merely lampoon the hypocrisy of a sworn foe to human bloodshed, prosecuting a bloody war on whales. But his intended audience could easily read between the lines, especially when he dropped vague hints that the Pequod's owners had their own queer backstories. Melville portrayed Nantucket as a queer place, with America's most elegant homes and parks, the product of the whaling profits at their historic peak. One and all they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. He stressed the essentially economic nature of whaling. People in Nantucket invest their money in whaling vessels the same way that you do yours in stocks. Pequod owners Peleg and Bildad were anomalous Quakers, modified by aspects altogether alien and heterogeneous. The precise nature of such an anomaly is the burning question. On the surface, Melville pretends that it is the bloody violence that these peace-loving men inflict upon innocent whales. They are fighting Quakers. They are Quakers with a vengeance. But, using the standard Victorian innuendos, Melville hinted at a parallel anomaly: sexuality. Peleg, who represents the same liberal wing of Quakerism as Hicks and Whitman, is notably virile, brown and brawny like most old seamen, and hardly a bourgeois prude, since he is prone to spouting half-humorous innuendos. Peleg apparently believes that the serious religious matters that plague his neighbors are mere trifles. Melville ingeniously cribbed Peleg's name from Genesis, for in his day the earth was divided. Bildad represents the evangelical side of the Hicksite schism. The Bible called his namesake the son of contention or strife. Melville observes that Bildad's fundamentalism made him a most surprising figure, the queerest old Quaker I ever saw. Like other sailors, both of these friends relished adventure and displayed dashes of character not unworthy of a poetical pagan Roman. All of Melville's well-educated readers had been warned to gloss over references to same-sex acts in Greek and Roman classics. In fact, the crabby, Bible-loving Peleg utterly lacked heterosexual reflexes. The sight of many unclad, lovely island creatures round the Horn, all that had not moved this native-born Quaker one single jot, had not so much as altered one angle of his vest. Is it any coincidence that Nantucketers should be rather distrustful of all aliens unless they hailed from Cape Cod or the Vineyard?
Captain, what should I do if I get seasick?
Don't worry, you'll do it. What do I care if there's a storm ahead?
The bell in the old tower rings.
Quiet, quiet! What's going on up there?
Captain, the men are revolting.
Yes, aren't they? All hands on deck. Heave ho, my lads. Spread sail and gather the life of a sailor for me. Oh, heart me, oh, heart me, oh, heart me, a dearie tar goes very far away to sea. Sailor's life
Melville's Mardi was even more forthcoming about maritime bromance. Consider the following condensed excerpt. I had no idea of being without a companion. Now among the crew was a fine old seaman, one Jarl. His hands were brawny and his long yellow hair waved around his head like a sunset. For Jarl I had a wonderful liking, for he loved me. From the first had cleaved to me. It is sometimes the case that an old mariner like him will conceive a very strong attachment for some young sailor, his shipmate, an attachment so devoted as to be wholly inexplicable. He was my laundress and tailor. I was indebted to my good Viking's good care of me. Yet in some degree the obligation was mutual. For be it known that, in sea parlance, we were chummies. Now this chummying among sailors is like the brotherhood between collegians rooming together. But however it was, my Viking, thy unbidden affection was the noblest homage ever paid me. In conclusion, maritime toxic masculinity must be viewed as a historian's Pandora's box. Once we dare unlock the lid, an inky cloud of ghastly, sordid demons rush out. Unspeakably rough, boring, poorly paid, and dangerous work. Superstition, violence, and cruel discipline. Gambling and alcoholism. Isolation, loneliness, and sickness, including venereal disease, and chronic contempt and discrimination. Sailors were the wheels on Melville's coach. These peculiarities were the muck and mire they were dragged through, while the insiders sped on to great profit. But at the bottom of Pandora's box, the final creature to emerge was a shining spark called hope. For Melville, that spark was ignited by the varied thrills he sought on the boundless seas. And the greatest of all these thrills was his offshore refuge for a dear chum's love. For some sailors, I must believe, the price they paid for that was ultimately worth it all.